Pratiksha Singh is a multidisciplinary practitioner. She collaboratively explores how applying a living system lens can provide additional tools and perspectives for working with complex yet adaptive challenges. She's driven to be working with diverse voices and harnessing inclusive and plural images of the future. Pratiksha is currently based in Bangkok as the head of experimentation with the UNDP, Asia Pacific Regional Innovation Center, the United Nations Development Program, where she supports the building of institutional innovation capabilities within regional UNDP offices. These capabilities range from foresight to reflecting on cohesion of current portfolios, systems change theory, and public policy innovation. Pratiksha holds a master's in design and strategic foresight and innovation from OCAD University in Toronto. She sits on the board of the Association of Professional Futurists. She chairs an annual virtual APF Futures Festival and is the 2019 Next Generation Foresight Practitioner Global Award recipient. She's a committed Black and white film photographer. And I don't know if you'll be sharing any of that with us, but it's helpful to know a little context. Thank you so much. And without taking any more time, Pratiksha, I'll turn it over to you.
Hi, everyone. So thank you so much for the introduction. I am indeed based in Bangkok, so it is just 12 hours ahead, so 9 p.m. over here. And yeah, so you already know a little bit more about my background and what I do. And I hope that what at the end of this presentation you will see is that there's a through line to the way that I practice my work and the values and principles that have been driving my practice and foresights, and how that is sort of an integral part of how I am on the board, and sort of the principles that I stand for on the board being around equity and representation. Because foresight, it hasn't traditionally been that that much of a global field or that much of a diverse sort of diverse field. So but it's been making amazing strides in the last few years, as I think all of you can agree. The word foresight and futures has sort of gained more popularity, and so I think that's a positive step towards having more voices at least engage in that conversation. And that through line comes into how the Futures Festival runs. And I really look forward to speaking to you as well about that sort of power that we have as convening bodies and as convening beings who run events, who have the opportunity to choose who to bring forth as speakers, and how that power can really help amplify diverse voices and worldviews, not just sort of visual diversity. During grad school, so of course, as Eric mentioned, I went to OCAD. I took a leave actually between my studies, and for a few years, just worked on my own. And it was partially about exploring ways to apply the theories that we were learning in grad school around foresight and systems out in communities. And I explicitly chose wanting to work outside the realm of academia and corporate foresight, and actually to a large degree government, although I engaged on projects with government. So I explored how to actually take these concepts and principles out to others who haven't studied them in their master's programs, or who don't necessarily have the resources to hire me to do multiple month projects. And I worked with young people of color. I worked with young immigrant youth in Toronto, first generation, residents. And I also worked with the federal government. I actually worked with ESDC in Ottawa for several months. And in my work, looking at youth employment, actually, sort of drizzled in foresight wherever I could in my engagements as a way to sort of discuss the past, present, future, and how does actually bringing that narrative and that through line allow us to perhaps have different types of conversations. And I also worked extensively in healthcare, though not in foresight, but applying systems and systems visualizations as a way to explore through our clients how actually concrete and thorough systems mapping can be used to advocate successfully for policy change. And so I think that probably hopefully resonates with many of you in terms of the capacity of scope that our work offers us to sort of play with. I went back after a few years to finish my master's because I knew it was either then or never. And so that was part of my research, final research work. And so at that point, I'd already been on the board. I had already been running Futures Festival. I had already been having, been working with, through empathy, and of course have finished coursework. And one of the through lines that I constantly kept coming up with that I couldn't put aside was this notion of inclusivity and representation within the field. And so actually my research study became ultimately to understand the sort of Western influence on the field of foresight as a former academic field, and to sort of make a case for its transition from being what it was to being an ally in being more inclusive. And what ended up coming out of it, although completely unintentional, was this initial authoring of a framework that I hope to share with you today in the brief time we have, called Lotus. And fundamentally it ended up becoming is becoming a guide rather to support practitioners who fundamentally want to question their own belief systems, their own worldviews, and their own sort of unintentional groundings to their work in a way that unearths these things in the hope that we can actually fundamentally, as a practice, personal and professional, move towards generating futures with our broader community that are hopefully more inclusive and plural and culturally sensitive and anti-colonial. And those are big words. And so this is what I hope to share with you will show how it's not just my own framework, but actually it's a community asset that's going to be ever evolving. And so I really hope you can contribute to that, both tonight in a conversation, but also after today's conversation. Actually, if it's okay with you, I'll actually maybe take just a few minutes and walk you through the framework, and then come back to some of the other ways in which this framework has informed the ways in which I've applied it to work once I left and joined UNDP. So let me just escape this and then just share with you the website. So if you go to my website, which I'm happy to share links with you, and it's also in the presentation, but I actually just put this out a few days ago, and I'm actually really excited to share it with you and get your feedback. But part of the framework that I want to share with you tonight, and it's fundamentally about, sort of ways in which we can practice becoming more intentional practitioners in the field, is objectively about increasing worldviews and representation in the space. And this notion that I think, while I authored this a couple of years ago, I think globally, especially in the region at least that I live in and I'm immersed in now and in the Asia Pacific, there is a growing normalization of dominant narratives being forced as the normative. And I think, not to be preaching, but I think just as a practitioner, as a responsible foresight practitioner, for me, that my response has been to challenge myself to even more operate from a place of self-awareness and intentionality, so that I can, through my work, challenge, I think, some of those notions, because they are not representative, I think, of many, many voices. And so I think that's partly when I was reflecting on updating this and putting the framework here, I wanted to reflect on, in 2021, why does work like this still remain so relevant? And I think, I hope that in partnership with you, we can actually make it much more reflective as well of the needs of the time. The framework is actually intended to push us to actually challenge our practice as practitioners across multiple realms. I was quite conscientious, and I hope when you actually, if you have a moment after the presentation, look through it, to think about, how is it that we actually prescribe value and worth in the field? Because how we prescribe value and worth is fundamentally the foundation of anything we do and what we keep. And that leads us to how we conceive knowledge, how we transfer knowledge, what we even consider as valid knowledge, and whose knowledge do we consider valid. And so these are small differentiations that have profound impact in both what becomes part of the field or has been part of the field formally, and I think what going forward can be part of the field. And part of this is opening that shell, I think, for us to be much more conscientious and open to this. And of course, once we think about how we conceive and transfer and validate knowledge, and what knowledge we consider valid, is fundamentally then what we consider as being part of the field, the ontology of the field. And fundamentally, of course, from the ontology and what we even consider part of the field comes our methods and our ways that we practice, the tools that we tend to create and use. And these are all things that I wanted to challenge at some point. And I am very privileged to have had several months to be able to reflect on my own experiences, and also through experts and interviews with practitioners from around the world, actually from multiple different disciplines, form sort of this, this basis to create something. I also, I think, want to, and hopefully, again, as you see some of these materials with a bit more time, realize that I think without even knowing unintentionally, there's a number of accepted, generally accepted principles about frameworks. And I really wanted to interrogate many of them, from the things like the 2D aspect, the static aspect of frameworks that we are traditionally used to. I think fields like, and conversations about equity and representation and being culturally sensitive are evolving topics. And so I wanted to create something that I think, as my own and my collective knowledge evolves, so does this framework. Not to create multiple things, but actually to have that very same thing grow. And so this notion of a dynamic framework. What I will share with you today is still in a static form as I convert to being more dynamic, but to share with you some of the things that I think we take for granted. This notion of authorship, I'm actually quite uncomfortable being called the author. I see myself as a primary author. And that's in part because I think frameworks as being singular authors are not very, it's not very true, because most of the work we do is inspired by things, inspired by people, inspired by the things that we're reading. And my framework is, and this framework in particular, is certainly that. It is an amalgamation of inspiration from many practitioners and many people's representations and experiences. And so this notion of what could a framework be if it became a community asset, in that we could all contribute to it. And there are several other elements as well in terms of even a visual statement. How used to are we to seeing frameworks in ways that actually are circles, squares, and triangles, and actually not as comfortable seeing a framework that perhaps looks a bit like this. And I think for me, this was a bit of a risk, but perhaps grad school allows you to take that risk in saying, if I were to put this forward to you and say it is a thorough framework, but it looks like this, you might take it less seriously. But I think if everything about this framework, from the choice of it being a lotus, to why it's a lotus, to why it's even a pink lotus, are all actually very conscious choices on my part as a designer. And I speak a lot about this in detail, but all to share with you that I think we all, I think this is what I'm really grateful for about design school. I think this notion of challenging yourself and challenging what we're given as sort of, as I mentioned, accepted principles. This node to holism versus reductionism. It'd be much easier for me to just have a very pretty flower with just the petals, as opposed to also showing you the roots. But actually what I realized as I was working on a framework, and all of this hopefully translates towards the end of this small chat, into seeing why this is so important. But actually our roots anchor us. And for me, the roots anchor my principles, anchor my practice. And I wanted to pose sort of this anchoring principle to practitioners who wanted to use this framework to ask themselves certain questions. And actually this is inspired by Hinduism and Buddhism, the lotus, and what the lotus actually stands in these two religions. But what I was even more inspired was that while the inspiration came from this place, around the world, lotuses are known to grow in muddy water and to rise above that muddy water and be this beautiful thing. And I think for me, as I was writing this, I was in India, and I was surrounded by a lot of discourse around anti-nationalism, which is only getting stronger. And I only say this to say that as I was writing this, I couldn't help but be surrounded by this discourse. And for me, it started to represent this negativity and this polarization that has been surrounding us. And actually, how could a framework like this offer an alternative to what might be overwhelmingly the norm in terms of discussions and discourse? Just quickly, a few other principles, and then I will move on. But in a lotus, often actually the leaves provide a layer of division between the water and the petals. And again, this was actually very symbolic to me, because I started to realize as I was authoring this and I was in India, if I was coming in without having a true knowledge of the cultural and social discourse that was taking place at the time, it might be very simple for me to come with the right intentions of wanting to do inclusive futures work in India. But actually, the difference between the muddiness and, I think, to me, what is the beauty of inclusion and plurality is an acceptance, a conscious acceptance of the fact that we have to ask ourselves, if in a country censorship and openness and the ability to actually discuss plurality is even accepted, or if doing so fundamentally puts people at a risk of being called dissidents and anti-national. And those are very, very real things, at least for me in the region, again, that I live in, and I think many, many other countries. And so, and maybe even very close to home, to be honest. And so I think this notion of, before we can actually practice something that sounds so positive, we have to, as practitioners, be really aware of the broader environment within which we want to do this work, and whether this work will actually maybe perhaps even put people at risk, yourselves included. I think if we can pass those things, this is where I as I think it gets exciting, is what I pose to you through this framework is in layers, different kinds of prompts and questions. If the core is actually to surface diverse futures and worldviews, how do actually we perhaps even start in the first layer by asking ourselves questions of how we design our sessions? You have to excuse the visual change. This is my design work, and that's a professional designer. So I'm not a graphic designer, but I wanted to share with you a few things that I hope will spur our discussions, and actually why these things matter so, so deeply. I think as foresight practitioners, whenever we do work in communities, we hold a lot of power. And we hold a lot of power to also influence many different elements of power and privilege that we take into our work. When we even design an initiative, we actually have, we set that sort of purpose and objective of a future session ourselves generally, without maybe in consult with the audience itself. I'm not saying that's always the case, just saying that that is the power we hold. As practitioners, we also hold the power of designing the kinds of imbalances that might come forth in that room when we are between who is facilitating a session and who is participating in a session. And those are very real constructs of power. And I think the last is, as practitioners, at least one of the other, sort of power principles I was exploring and playing with, wanting to dismantle, or at least consciously be aware of as I design, is how, as a practitioner, I could have the power to create further imbalances based on how I decide just purely to organize my session. What are the methods I use? What are those sort of outputs I create? How and when do I do these sessions? And these are very small things that I think, though, are actually very powerful in terms of the equation we set with who and how we work. And there's, when you see this work, there's actually also principles, right? So when you set an objective of a futures exercise, and I hope through all of this, instead of just listening to me, I hope you're also able to reflect a bit on your own practice. And I hope this resonates, and really I look forward to hearing about that. These were some concepts that emerged to me as I was working on this. They felt really important for me to be concise and clear about. When we set an objective, and when we have people participating, at least I can speak from practice, certainly even now in my own work. It's very easy to work with middle organizations that represent the groups that ultimately we will be doing work with, or who we serve. And I think it's a conscious realization to just even remind myself that nothing I should do in my sessions should be without the people that I am ultimately serving in the room. And so in sort of this framework, I started to realize that I think a lot about these things, and perhaps I know what what tools can help me even think about the diversity of participants I should have in a room. And so part of this is this was sort of where I think that idea of a community tool and asset also was born, in that I started to realize that for each of these petals in all three layers, I could reference to different practitioners who were spending time creating frameworks and research studies and practices built just on these specific tenets. And so that's part of the goal, is how can I connect each petal actually to work of other people, so that if this isn't something you know particularly too much about, how can we actually create this this framework that actually isn't just with foresight practitioners, but actually practitioners across disciplines who spend a lot of time thinking about these very questions of equity and the many ways in which this manifests. The second layer is, again, these more deeper, wider principles, that inclusive design, sort of inclusive futures principles. And I couldn't find principles anywhere as I was searching. So I didn't actually set out to create this framework. I was really just trying to write up my research. And I realized that whether it was academic walls or research walls, I couldn't find inclusive design principles that coherently sort of brought together multiple different layers. I couldn't find inclusive futures principles. And so I ended up sort of creating some based on these things. And their locations matter, actually. Sorry, it's not so visible. I'm happy to, if you don't make fun of my PowerPoint level of visual skills here. Going to OCAD made me very conscious of working with brilliant designers and my non-visual design skills. For example, these were sort of the principles that ended up coming out of this work. And they're all actually specifically placed in the locations based on the petals. And the goal is actually, when this framework is online and dynamic, that you can actually move petals and shift them in different places, because I realized I put them in this order, but you might actually want to ask these questions in a different order. Who am I to even though as a primary author, I'm putting them there for you to respond to, but who am I to actually tell you to read them in this way or in this order? So my goal is actually what I'm playing with and experimenting with, and if anybody would like to join me, is saying, actually, if we move things around, what are some new principles that might emerge at these different intersections? And for each of them, in my research, I explained to you at least how I see these principles playing out. What do they mean to me? How do I define them? Not that this is the only definition, but merely to give you a place of inquiry in terms of where I see this coming. And the last sort of layer is, I think, maybe more resonant in some sense, is after we've looked about how we design a physical room and interaction, which is that first layer, what might be some of those principles I actually want to fundamentally keep in my mind as the second layer, then became for me integral to think about what are the kinds of prompts and elements I need to keep in my sessions that actually allow me to be much more sensitive and aware of the different geographies and places that I'm working with. And so I have all sorts of things that I ended up putting here based on my research and based on my interviews. And some things, again, sound random. So there's, another sort of glossary key to things, but, something that was really interesting for me that made me actually explicitly consider spoken and oral languages, for example, which is right here at the bottom, was speaking to practitioners that were going to Japan and South Korea to do futures work. And to my knowledge, what they told me was that there is no plural word for futures in these languages. And so when they went there, they had to, on the fly, sort of adjust. And I put this here so that if you are going someplace, to even consider something so minor, that just because in English we have future and we have futures and we work in the plural, that very concept may not translate. And so how can using a framework like this actually allow you to prepare yourself for that translation, so that when you go there, at best, you can actually at least create a bridge, of a conceptual bridge, if not a literal sort of linguistic bridge, to the kinds of things that we're trying to get to. And so this is in part something that I've invested a lot of time in and a lot of energy thinking about and evolving. It's not static, like I said, even in its content. There's already things that I'm constantly realizing need to be here that are not, but to the degree possible, everything from funding to the kinds of ethical considerations we should take, including asking ourselves, are we the right person for this job? There's lots of practitioners that want to come to work in our region. And sometimes it's because it's an exciting region for many people, but that does not make them the right practitioner for this job. And so I think part of my aim was to politely create a space to put these kinds of provocations and questions in front of you, in front of me, in front of anyone who's using it, so that we can at least ask ourselves and answer those questions. and not chalk it up to not even having thought about it before we go, because I think we have a profound responsibility and we have an impact when we work with people. And so this is in part what the intention was of this framework. And I am at this next stage where I am sort of in my drawer consistently making note of different kinds of frameworks and practitioners that I can actually link this work to. And again, not just in the foresight field, but across fields. And so I would actually love to hear from any of you who might be in your work, in your interests, in your free time, actually be following different kinds of practitioners who perhaps think about, this concept of time in multiple different ways. We think of time as linear, but we know many cultures don't. How does that fundamentally impact the way that we do this work of inclusive futures? If the very notion of time, which is like foundational to what we're doing, isn't even seen in the same way. And so these were the kinds of things that I spent a great deal of time thinking about and felt very lucky to have the time to reflect and think of. And the other reason I wanted to actually ultimately sort of ended up coming up with this was I got to spend several months thinking about this, but not everybody might. But I think many, many people do want to be much more conscious and intentional in their practice. And so how can we create something that allows for that space? So that's definitely a work in progress that I'm constantly building and further sort of developing, and would love to engage with you on further. Building off that work with the Lotus, last year while I was working at the UNDP on the side, at the moment last year, we were just in the days of the pandemic and crisis response. And this opportunity came up by the International Women's Development Agency based out of Australia, who were saying that post-COVID, they want to run sessions in the Pacific, but they want to use feminist principles to come up with feminist futures after the pandemic. And as you can imagine, and feminist principles aren't just about gender. Actually, it's about, a very thorough and sincere level of intersectionality being a foundation to how we do this work. And in coming up with this, a number of us, so this was a sort of consortium of practitioners, we worked with Changist as the foundational sort of consulting company and authored this framework for IWDA. And what we realized, and in sort of an additional level of analysis after having worked on Lotus, was I think the sense of awareness that hopefully we can have a discussion about, for me, felt that the field is not very feminist. It's rarely in its frameworks provokes us to think about gender or intersections. And I think that was something that while we were writing this framework, we were actually interrogating and actually authoring and thinking about and layering above the field. And that was actually a very, very, it was actually a very profound, again, in small ways, but actually very profound experience because it made me, again, be very critical of the way that our field is structured and the very foundations of our field and how there is so much room for growth if more of us want to engage in that conversation and that evolution of allyship. And lastly, before I stop speaking, is just this notion of foresight in our sort of broader institutions. I mean, I work for UNDP, I work in the regional innovation team, and slowly through time have been sort of creating this space, this container to talk about foresight. And I think the pandemic really helped me in creating more paths, although not in the immediate aftermath. While I tried, I realized, people are in crisis response and they don't really have time to think about these things, which is why foresight is never done. I think at the very, impetus of implosion, like not at the very point of implosion, but actually much ahead. And so, at least it's opened the interest and actually not just interest, but a sense of urgency. And the ways that we're applying foresight in UNDP is internal capacity building. How do we even talk about these principles? How do we start at the very basics of these principles? How do we actually make our programming and our design of projects much more future conscious and adaptive and responsive? How do we actually engage with our partners, which for UNDP is largely governments? How do we engage with our governments in a way that actually offers these principles of anticipatory governance, these principles of inclusion, And, in some of the things that I'm designing, I'm experimenting with our country offices on how do we weave in these notions of gender and climate and socioeconomic inequity and inequality as sort of staple things that we have to consider in all of our in our work. And again, I design sessions and I run them, so I think I have some I have some flexibility to play with these things. And these are some 3 things at least that I'm trying to play with in how do we include them. And for me, this is part of this discussion that I'm sharing with you is when we're doing this sort of work in environments where foresight isn't as hasn't yet been embraced as heavily, how do we start in some small places and build that space for conversation? And in closing, I think for me, one thing that's been interesting is beyond just having them consider gender, climate, and socioeconomic inequality and inequity is asking colleagues why they see these 3 things playing out the way they see them in their scenarios. Is socioeconomic inequity being caused by religious motives, or is it being caused by climate change? Is it being caused by governments and government policies? Because that why is actually a really, really important entry point for me, because I am, much like many of us are, actually visitors to many of the countries that I work in. I'm not from there. So that why offers me a window to not assume that the same reason a particular thing is playing out in one country in our region is playing out in another. And so for me, this is a little bit of a snippet to share with you around my practice and how Inclusive Futures has been evolving from my work in my consulting practice with empathy with communities to having worked now with UNDP and working actively with our country offices and governments in the region. And yeah, I hope I'm not over time, but yeah, this was kind of some of the things I wanted to share with you. And I'd love to hear if any of that sparked anything, particularly as policy horizons and the power that you hold, implicit or explicit, in the public sector. So yeah, over to you.
Thanks so much, Diksha. Thanks so much for that insightful presentation and for sharing with us your Lotus framework. We feel privileged to be among the first that you shared it with. So thanks so much for that.